Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video we're back with another Big Brother video, one that I've done a Survivor version of, and here we'll be talking about the best players for every letter of the alphabet, where again, I did do a Survivor version of this video, where I run through every letter of the alphabet, and talk about who I think the best player is for each letter based on first name, and again, here we'll be doing the same thing. Now, again, technically, if you really wanted to, if you want to scroll through my ranking of every Big Brother player, and just the time to analyze who's at highest placement for every letter, it pretty much just spoil the entire video, but again, screw it, we're gonna do it anyway. So again, we'll be going through A through Z, talking about who I think the best player is in the grand scheme of things, again, taking into consideration how they would do in multiple appearances, not just their specific seasons that they played. So with that, let's start it off with the letter A, which there's a very easy answer for the letter A. Now, outside of the person I did pick, I mean, there are some solid other options. You got players like Amanda Zuckerman and Angela Rummins. Again, both played competent first-time games, but were not my pick. Same thing goes with like Austin from BB17, who I think played a somewhat impressive game on that season. April from BB6, also another person I very much considered, though did not pick. In terms of returning players, I mean, Allison is obviously a big name on the board. Someone that obviously had a pretty impressive game on BB4, and again, not as good on BB7, but again, just was not picked here. Also, for a winner that I did not pick, we got Adam, who again, is definitely one of the lesser winners in the grand scheme of things, but again, still a winner, so he was definitely in contention. I believe he was technically second place of these players, but the person I did end up going with is obvious. Again, one of the best players of all time. We got Andy Herron. And again, it's not really close. Again, Andy is easily a top 5 player of all time. Well, no one here even makes like top 25. So again, I think it's pretty apparent that Andy was going to be the pick here. I think he played one of the most impressive individual games in the history of the show, and also one that I think could be repeatable. Now, I think there's definitely a chance if he were to play again on a season where obviously people know his reputation, where he would have a target on his back. But I think in most given situations, if people don't know who he is, I think he could repeat the game that he played the first time multiple times. So again, he was my pick for the letter A. Now for the letter B. And here we got a pretty definitive answer here. I mean, there's really only one other player in my top 100, my actual player ranking, which was Brett from BB20, which would not be the best pick on the board, where beyond that, you had people like Brittany Hoops and Bailey, who are again like right outside the top 100, though the easy pick here is Brittany Haynes. Again, Brittany, while not like a truly elite player within like my top 20 players of all time, she's still someone that is still a very skilled player for the game. Again, had 2 deep runs, had an actual pretty impressive run in BB14, and having a lot of control over the game, only be sniped out after Dan's funeral. And even in BB12, again, there were decent aspects of her game. Again, she was very good socially. While she was outplayed by the Brigade, I feel like, again, still a competent game there. I feel like she's the type of player that probably just makes it deep on most given seasons, with also, again, still maintaining some win equity on both those seasons. So again, pretty definitive answer for the letter B. Next up for the letter C, where there is a very clear answer here. Yeah, despite that, again, I think there's a good chunk of other contenders. I mean, there are a good chunk of other players in my top 100. I mean, you have like Corey Wartenberger, I think played a solid game in BB25. Considered Cam, made it the final 3, played a pretty stable game. Obviously has issues in terms of like some passingness at points and lack of loyalty. I think he's at least someone to mention here. You have Cliff Hogg, who I think is an understated player. Corey Brooks is just a kind of competent all-around player, even though there's really nothing too special about him. You have obviously Suri Fields, where again, if we were taking her appearances on other shows into this, she probably would be number 1, considering she literally beats the person I did pick for the letter C. But also, again, we do have Christmas, who is a returning player, where while she wasn't that close to being picked, again, someone at least mentioned here. But obviously, got to consider Chelsea. I mean, Chelsea, obviously, most recent winner, played a very dominant game. Very impressive game on paper. The reason she's not the pick here is because, again, I do think there are some issues I have with her game strategically. I think there's points where she contemplates moves that make no real sense. There's points where she actually starts to enact those moves. That leads to sloppy play that could backfire on her. To where, again, I think those are my major gripes with Chelsea that makes her not my pick here. Again, the person I went with here, obviously, is Cody. Again, Cody, 2-time player, made it to the end both times, won in his second appearance in one of the most dominant games in the history of the show. Also played a very impressive runner-up game as well, to where, again, Cody is very easily picked, very well-rounded player, again, very good at challenges, very good socially, and when it comes to strategically, again, while, yeah, he was outplayed by Derek his first time around, I think he really learned from that lesson his second time around, had this killer instinct, and, again, played a very impressive game, to where, again, I think he is a very impressive player. So because that, for me, he was my easy pick for a letter C. Next up for the letter D, and, I mean, what do you think? Well, there were a decent amount of other contenders. Again, there are a lot of winners and pretty solid multi-time players, with the letter D probably being one of the most stacked in the history of Big Brother, though again, you got the likes of Danny Donato, you have Diane Henry, you have obviously the iconic Daniel Reyes, all very much in consideration here. But Daniel Reyes being a top 10 player for me, and beyond that, you also have a decent amount of winners. I mean, while Evil Dick wasn't that close to being in consideration, you also had Drew, who is again a very competent player. You had Derek, obviously someone that's commonly talked about as one of the best players of all time, though again, the number one pick is by far Dan Giesling, who I think is the best player of all time. Again, I think it's not particularly close here to where, while again, Derek is technically right behind him. I mean, I think there's no real competition here. I think, for me, Dan is, at this current point, the best player of all time. So it really takes someone having another really impressive run to really usurp him. So again, pretty easy pick there. Next up for the letter E, and this one was actually pretty tough, as this is one there I really debated on whether or not to follow my original player ranking, as this one definitely felt rocky, where, I mean, it's really between two people. Now, technically, Erica from BB4 and All Stars, again, was at least in consideration, considering she was, again, at least within my top 80 of my last list. But again, was not really in contention, though, again, the top two, it was close between the two. I believe they're back-to-back on my player ranking. So again, it became tough to decide this. However, the person I did not go with here is Eric Stein. And again, I really wanted to pick Eric Stein. I do feel like in my gut there is something saying that maybe I should have gone Eric Stein, but I just feel like the issue of Eric Stein is that obviously we only have his one appearance, and even in that, again, he never really got to naturally play the game, because that makes it very tough to truly assess his game. While I do have faith that he would play a very impressive game on most given seasons, I feel like it's tough to really assess that with the knowledge that we do have. So because of that, I ended up having to go with Enzo. To where, again, like in comparison to Eric Stein, I definitely have much more faith in Eric Stein's strategic decision making. I also think Eric is a lot more aware of what he's doing in the game than someone like Enzo. But again, Enzo has played twice, made it to the end both times, has a final 2 appearance, has a final 3 appearance. Now his win equity in both of those, very rocky. Likely loses to everybody at the final 3 in both of his seasons. So again, that's not good. But again, he still had a pretty solid game on BB All-Stars, again, part of the Dominant Alliance throughout the entire season. Actually had like a good chunk of connections in the game where he was actually safer than Cody for the majority of that game, while also seeming to have win equity at a point in that season where, again, I think Enzo is a understated player, where I get why people don't like Enzo, but again, I just think his consistency is enough to make him my pick here. Next up for the letter F, and I mean, the letter F is not particularly great for Big Brother. There's really only one player from the letter F that's in my top 100 players of all time, and even then, and really, I mean, this player is pretty deep within that. So again, this was pretty much the definitive pick, even though it's a person I didn't really want to pick. But again, really no one else was truly in consideration, as the other people to even talk about here are the likes of Frenchie and Frank Udy and Fessy and Felicia, who again had good stuff here and there, but still not enough to be the pick here. The person I picked here for letter F is Frankie. And again, I think Frankie is a very well-rounded player. Again, someone that is very good physically, one of the best challenge competitors of all time, decent socially at points. I mean, definitely can get on people's nerves and definitely can come off as a bit of a dick at points, but still decent socially at points, and strategically is very active. Again, you can qualm some of that strategy at points, but again, is at least actively maneuvering through the game, has a lot of agency. At least there's that. So where, again, I think Frankie is a very competent player. Again, in comparison to the people that are in consideration here, it's not really close. Frankie kind of has to be the pick, but even within that, again, I think Frankie is actually a pretty good player. Next up for the letter G, and this is probably one of the biggest train wrecks on the board, where I literally have nobody whose name starts with the letter G in my top 100 players of all time. I don't believe any of these players are my top 150 players of all time. To where, again, this is a rough group here for the letter G. Where, again, the people to talk about here, you got Glenn, you got Jerry from BB3, you got Gina Marie, to where I definitely did not want to pick Gina Marie. So the person I went with here, I guess, is Chicken George. I guess. So again, like, talking about Chicken George in a best player video is just kind of funny, but again, it's kind of the way it has to be here. Again, there's not really many options, and again, Chicken George at least made the final 5 of the people that are in consideration here. I mean, you have Glenn, who was a first boot, Jerry, who, again, was being targeted for a lot of that season, still was, again, booted at final 7, and then you have Gina Marie, who gets to the end, but had absolutely no win equity. And while, again, you could definitely call him George's win equity, I feel like George, this was a lot more palatable to the house, where people like Chicken George. Yeah, most people did not like Gina Marie. So again, I guess I'm going Chicken George here. Next up for the letter H, and this one's pretty easy. Now, again, there's definitely considerations. You got Helen from B15, who I think is a very competent player. You got Holly, obviously runner-up, and someone that definitely had impressive aspects at portions of their game. You have Hardy, who I think played a very impressive game for the time back in BB2, and I think had it been a more natural format of having a veto involved, I think he more than likely does win that season. You do have Hannah Chada, who I think is also a very competent player, one that Had not been for the cookout, I think maybe there's a world where she does a bit better in the game. But really, again, this is definitive. Again, the only player here that's in my top 10, I believe the only player here that's in my top like 40 or so. And that player is Hayden Moss. And again, Hayden obviously also a winner, the only winner in contention here. And again, played a very impressive game, very well-rounded player, won a lot of challenges, very good socially, also has the killer instinct to make the moves necessary to win the game. Again, I think Hayden was just a pretty easy pick on the board here. Next up for the letter I, and the letter I is a bit rough. I mean, not many people to pick from. I mean, we have the likes of Indy from BB24. We have the likes of Izzy from BB25, who I love Izzy as a character, but again, not really going to be picked for a best player list. You have Yvette, who, again, is a runner-up at least, but I didn't want to pick Yvette. So, I mean, the only person left is, again, a winner. So at least there's that. But we got Ian Terry. And again, I think over time, my opinion of Ian Terry's game just continuously goes down. I think my opinion of Ian as a player continuously goes down. However, again, look who we're comparing him to. Again, there's not many other options. I feel like Ian, again, while one of the worst winners on the board, is still a winner. I think in comparison to Yvette, at least won the game. I mean, something, I guess. And to be fair, I think Ian, again, at least like knows the game pretty well. While, again, he doesn't really play to that, and I don't think he plays the most optimal game in the world. Again, he at least knew the game. And on most appearances, I would assume he would know what he should do. Maybe. Anyway, went with Ian here. Next for the letter J, and the letter J is actually one of the most stacked letters on this list. I believe it's actually the letter that has the most appearances in my top 80 from my previous list. And with that, again, a lot of people to talk about here. And you got a lot of competent non-winners from the likes of Jesse Goddard, who had a pretty impressive game in BB11. And James Ryan had 2 pretty okay appearances. You obviously got Janelle, who's a massive icon of the show, to where, again, while she wasn't that close to being my pick, again, at least is someone notable to bring up here. You got Big Jeff to talk about, where he has 2 pretty deep runs. Same thing with James Hewling, who has a decent track record. You have JC, who I think plays, again, one of the better one-time non-winning games, where while you could definitely qualm with his actions in the game, again, it still turned out to be a decent game there. You also have Jason Guy, again, one of the best non-winning players, where he was definitely in consideration. Though, also, again, there are a lot of winners from the letter J, to where I did end up going with a winner by the end of it, to where, I mean, outside of that, you do have Jag. I mean, that's something. But you also have, like, Jordan, though she wasn't really that close to being contention. Same thing with Josh Martinez. Jackson is a player here, though. Again, the person I went with here is June. I think June is, again, a very strong player for the time. And again, for back in BB4, I think she plays a very impressive game, really floating through the game in a way that was just kind of perfect for that season. It had these 2 warring sides, and her and Allison were really able to ride the middle, first independently, but then able to work together towards the end game. Now, again, I definitely have qualms with her game. I think she definitely burns some jury votes at points. I don't think she treats people particularly well at points, but still, I think she navigates through the game pretty well, especially with her really getting Allison to be fully loyal to her, though, again, also, because it was also in Allison's best interest, but still, again, I think still good player. Probably one of the more competent strategic players, especially for the time. Again, was my pick here. Now, I think, again, it actually is probably somewhat close between her and Jason, to where I think Jason's probably a more well-rounded player, but I think June really excels in that one aspect of the game, and also, again, is a winner, so easily my pick here. Next for the letter K, and I did not think I'll be picking the person I did, but again, a lot of people in my top 80 from the letter K as well. You got the likes of Krista from BB2, Kyle Kapner is a person, so that's something. Karen from BB5, I think, is an underrated player. Kyland, I think, plays a pretty competent game in BB23. From a returning player's point of view, you got Keisha, who I think played pretty well in BB10. Kevin Campbell, I think, played pretty well in BB11, though the answer here is a winner. You got Casey. And again, I've definitely talked negatively about Casey's game in the past. I do stand by that. However, I do think Casey still is a very well-rounded player. While I don't think she necessarily has the strategic chops on this season, I do feel like we see on the challenge, the fact that she kind of does nowadays, at least has a little bit more of a killer instinct. Well, she's obviously incredible socially. People just adore her. And she's very good physically, to where, again, I think Casey is a very solid player. So while I, again, don't have much faith in her strategically, I think she really excels the other 2 aspects. So, again, easily the pick here. Next up for the letter L. And this one was a bit of a weird one. I did not expect to pick the person that I picked here either, with this one seeming a bit random on paper, to where, again, I mean, there's other people that made my top 100 from the likes of Liz, who was obviously a runner-up. You have a winner in Lisa, who I assumed was going to be the pick here. Yeah, the person I did go with instead is actually Lane from BB12, to where, again, I think this one was a bit of a debate. Obviously, Lisa is a winner, and through that, again, you would think that she would be the pick. I decided not to go with her simply because, again, I don't find her win overly impressive. And while Lane's game is not overly impressive in its own right either, I feel like Lane is a player that has gone a bit understated over time. I think he's a player that definitely plays a pretty competent game in the Brigade, again, being part of this really dominant alliance, but also I think is a player that was willing to work from outside that alliance. Again, we see him not necessarily working in the Brigade's best interests, then having this backup plan of working with Brittany and actually intending on bringing Brittany to the end, which again, I don't know if he would have won necessarily in that situation. It would have been close, but still, I think it does show him being willing to be more flexible in the game, and in general was liked in the house, and I think overall, it does come off as a pretty well-rounded player. Where, again, I think you could definitely call him this, and definitely Lisa, as she is a winner. Yeah, I do think Lane navigates through the game in a more impressive way to me than Lisa, where Lisa just felt like she was kind of being pulled along by Danielle and Jason, where, again, definitely credit her for making those bonds with them to where they want to take her to the end, but I don't know how intentional that necessarily was. Where I do feel like Lane's game was a bit more intentional, and because of that, for me, I did make him my pick here. Next up for the letter M, which does have a decent amount of contenders here as well. A decent chunk of players for my top 50 of my last list. Again, you have the likes of Matt Hoffman, who I think plays well at points in BB12, so again, he's in consideration. You got Monty, who is a runner-up, was one move away from winning the games. Again, that's something. You got the likes of Michael Bruner, also another one that plays a very impressive game for a lot of that season, was able to play the middle pretty well and win a lot of comps. You have Matt Klotz, who, again, I don't like, but I do think he played a very impressive game, being able to navigate through the game without ever being targeted and initially having a lot of win equity. You also have Memphis, obviously a person that's played twice, and obviously that does elevate him on the list a bit. But again, not enough to be actually in consideration here, to where, again, there's two winners on the board here to consider, and it is somewhat close between the two. I believe on my last player ranking, they are back-to-back, where one of these players is a lot more history. We definitely know a lot more about their game, while the other one is someone that only played once. Yeah, I did end up going with that person, so the person I didn't pick is Mike Boogie. And again, it's somewhat close. I think Boogie is a player that probably gets a bit shafted in the modern day. Again, there's definitely reasons to not like Boogie. But I do think from a gameplay perspective, I do think he doesn't really get his due, with a lot of people just owning that up to, oh, Will really dragged him through the game, when I don't really feel like that's the case. But also, I think he's just too inconsistent of a player to pick him here. So, the person I went with here is Maggie from BB6, to where, again, she won the season. I think her win is, again, definitely questionable. I mean, she had very questionable winner prospects. I think she definitely struggles to win against most people outside of Yvette. I think the large reason why she wins against Yvette is because Yvette made her own mistakes. And even then, again, the Sovereigns were very anti-Maggie. And in general, I think Maggie's jury prospects are something to definitely criticize from her, to where, while I do think her navigation through the game is impressive, again, her being able to pull over Howie and make the big mistake, trying to take out James, again, that is a very impressive move. And her being able to cultivate this alliance around the memory of Cappy is all very impressive as well. Where, again, I do think she is a very good player. I definitely have issues with it, but in comparison to the people that we talk about from the letter M, I feel, again, it's between her and Boogie. I just feel like Boogie comes off as too inconsistent to put him above Maggie, so again, Maggie is my pick. Next up for the letter N, and there is a very easy answer here. Yeah, there are a number of other considerations. I mean, there's a lot of Natalies that played Big Brother. Again, to be fair, none of them were really that close to make a list, but I at least wanted to mention them. And Natalie Negrotti, Natalie Cunio, and Natalie Martinez. Again, all of them okay-ish players, but again, I was never really going to pick them. You also have Nokomis, who I think is again, solid player. I think overrated in the grand scheme of things, but again, definitely, again, someone to at least mention here. But really, it comes down to the Nicoles, where we got 3 Nicoles that are somewhat high on my overall player ranking. Though, again, was not going to put on Nicole Anthony. I did not feel like her game was that great in the grand scheme of things, even though, again, not the worst player in the world. So it came down to the 2 Nicoles that made it to the finals. Yet the one I didn't pick, obviously, is Nicole Nielsen from BB2, because she didn't have many winner prospects, didn't win. So the person I did pick is Nicole Franzel. And again, it was kind of easy. I mean, Nicole Franzel, again, I have in my top 5. I do think Nicole is one of the best players at this point. Again, she's just demonstrated over and over again. She's able to get herself out of sticky situations and navigate through the game in a pretty impressive way, to where, while her jury prospects at points are questionable, she still, again, wins a season, gets to the final 3 in another season. And no one, again, has as history of a track record as she does of the players that started the letter N, where, again, it was pretty easy to pick her here. Next up for the letter O. And there's only one player from the letter O, where straight up from this point on, actually, a lot of letters from this point on are not really utilized amongst the list of Big Brother players, which is very strange, actually, how heavily weighted the beginning of the alphabet is. Yeah, again, letter O, we literally have one player, and it's a player that, again, is funny to be putting here, where I really like this person. This person was actually my winner pick for that season. It was the worst winner pick I've ever had, but again, I do like him. But again, we have Obi. Again, he's the only option. Again, I do think Ovi is a player that could have been good. I mean, while BB21 was obviously not a good spot for him, was pretty screwed on that season, he is still someone that demonstrates some ability. Again, he definitely has a good strategic mind for a game. We see him play Sequester afterwards, and again, was able to navigate through the game in a very impressive way, like realize when he's on the bottom and make moves accordingly to where, again, I think there's definitely potential there with Ovi. Now, did we see it on Big Brother? Not necessarily. But again, he's the only one here, so I guess we're going with him. Next up for the letter P. And, I mean, this one's kind of an easy one. I mean, there's, and some people in my top 100 from, like, Saporsha, who is obviously a runner-up. You got Paula Calafiore, who runs a lot of BB18. Yeah, then the person I'm going with here, obviously two-time player, two-time finalist. Got Paul. Not that hard to pick. Again, Paul has a sloppy game in BB18. It's not a great game. Yeah, really, I mean, I feel like that run alone probably would have made them enough to be the number one pick for the letter P. Yeah, they come back for BB19 and play one of the most dominant games in the history of the show, to where at that point, again, it's not even close. I mean, before that, again, I think it would have been somewhat close between him and Paulie. Yeah, I mean, after that, it's not particularly. So that appearance is just one of the most impressive non-winning games in the history of the show, to where, while, again, definitely had some very poor jury management, I still feel like they are a very competent player. So again, was my pick here. Now for the letter Q. In the letter Q, there's only one person to even be considered here, and here we do have Quinn from BB26, and Quinn? Shoaib, I mean, I think Quinn's still like a player that maybe would have potential on the return, though Shoaib, obviously, his game on BB26 was very bad, made a lot of bad decisions. Again, had two really terrible HOHs for him, particularly the Joseph one's just completely asinine. Him completely blowing one of the most powerful powers in the history of Big Brother is also a major knock against him. Where, while again, he is a big fan and seemed to know what he should be doing on paper, he simply was never really able to execute. So, considering he's literally the only option here, he's obviously the person I'm picking here. And moving on to the letter R, where this is kind of weird, where I did not expect to pick the person I ended up picking here, where obviously you got some considerations. I think Rachel Pletcher is an underrated player from BB6. You got Ryan, who is a runner-up, though, again, very rocky game there. You got Reagan, who I think plays a competent BB12 game. You have Rachel Riley, who is a winner of the show. Yeah, her win is not great. So the person I am going with here is Roddy, I guess? Again, did not expect to pick Roddy here. Yeah. Again, when looking at the field, I guess he is the best person whose name starts with an R. Again, while, again, it's a game that I don't know how adaptable it is, he's still playing a game that is specifically made for BB3. Again, he plays the game with the knowledge that players are going to be watching him from home, and through that, again, plays conservatively, kind of on purpose. Again, he does so much to try to manage his perception in the game, while also still having a lot of control over the game. That, again, I think his game is very impressive for the time. While he wasn't necessarily on my radar of someone I would pick for the letter R, I think it does make sense, considering, again, I think he does play a good game for the time. Next up, we got the letter S, and there's a pretty easy answer here, though, again, a decent amount of other contenders, people that were in my top 100, or at least near it. You got Sheila from BB9, who I think plays an okay game, but also you got Sharon from BB9, also, again, competent player. You got Spencer, BB15, also solid player there, really utilized the concept of being the pawn and was able to weaponize that. You have the likes of Shelly from BB13, who also played a very impressive game for the time. You also have Shane, who is a competent enough player that obviously comes somewhat close to winning that season, though again, did not pick him. But again, kind of easy answer here. Again, the only winner in consideration here. So while it's not like the best winner in the grand scheme of things, and a player that I am very hazy on their consistency, I feel like their winning game is solid, and that player is Steve. Again, I think Steve is a solid player. Again, he had a very active strategy. He had a strategy that he created before he came into the season, was able to enact it to a T. Really played from behind Vanessa the entire time and was able to cut her at the very end. Now, again, there are definitely points where I qualm with his strategic decision-making, specifically throwing the Final Four veto. But again, I think he is still a very solid player, was able to manage his threat level very well, was still able to convince Vanessa that he was going to take her to the end, and in general, just outplay Vanessa by the end, where, again, that is very good play, and I think he is a very competent player, even though, again, I think he would struggle on probably a lot of other seasons beyond that, but still good on his own right. So again, easy pick for the letter S. Now for the letter T. And the letter T actually has a very strong grouping of players here. Again, players that were all towards the top of my list. I mean, you have like Tommy Bracco from BB21, who I think is one of the better one-time players in the history of the show. You have a winner of the show in Taylor Hale, who again, was not my pick here, yet someone I very much considered. You also have Tiffany Mitchell, who I think plays one of the most impressive individual games in the history of the show, where had it not been for a cookout, she more than likely wins that season. The person I went with here, again, played one of the most impressive non-winning games in the history of the show, while also coming back and, despite not really being into the game, almost won the game again, and that person is Tyler. And again, Tyler definitely has been on a downward trek since his first appearance. I mean, his BB20 game is near perfection, where I think the way that he was able to really outplay the Falte Alliance in the pre-merge is extremely impressive. And he had his entire game set up by the time of the jury phase, where he really just lays back from that point on and is able to run the game without much difficulty. Now, the issue is the fact that he does essentially stop actively maneuvering through the game, to where I think he does get a bit too complacent, and I think he starts to lose his grip of the jury, where he's taking out these people that he would have been able to beat at the end over people that he wouldn't be able to beat. So again, that is bad, but still very impressive showing in BB20. BB22, again, very rocky. I, again, don't fully detract from him, because I do think, considering his headspace, he actually still plays a somewhat impressive game, getting to Final 6, a spot where he did have a lot of jury prospects, to where had he gotten to the end, I think he would have definitely had a shot to win, but obviously, was he that close to getting there? Not necessarily. But again, I think his BB20 game alone is already enough to have him in this spot of the list. I mean, I did already have him this high, and BB22 didn't really affect his overall ranking that much, to where, again, Tyler's still an all-time great player, even though a very flawed one. But again, I think in comparison to the likes of Taylor Hale, played a more consistent game than Taylor on their better seasons, while also, again, in comparison to Tiffany, I think has 2 appearances making it deep into the game, to where, if Tiffany were to come back and play a very impressive game again, I think she would probably surpass Tyler, though. Or right now, again, I think Tyler is the better player. He is my pick for letter T. Next up, the letter U. And there's no player from the letter U. I mean, there wasn't even one for Survivor. So again, very unlikely there was one for Big Brother, and there isn't. So moving on. Next up, the letter V. And there's not many options here, to where there's a very good option. But outside that, the other ones are not that good. You got Victoria from BB16, obviously not great. You got Victor, who's fine. Again, competent enough player, but wasn't going to be the pick here, to where, again, it was very clearly going to be Vanessa. I mean, Vanessa played a very impressive game, one of the best non-winning players in history of the show. Very well-rounded player. Again, very good at comps. Very good strategically, obviously. Obviously, socially is the thing you would definitely dock from her, but she's not a complete dud in the sense that she did have good connections to the likes of the Oz twins, and obviously had Steve in her corner for a lot of the game. There were, again, like, there are things to definitely praise from Vanessa in that light as well. There were, and Vanessa is a very strong player, one of the most impressive players in the history of the show. Very easily to pick for the letter V. Next up, the letter W. And what do you think? I mean, I'm not going to pick Will Winkle when we have Will Kirby on the board. And again, Will Kirby, I definitely criticize many aspects of his game. I've talked about numerous times now, where in comparison to the best of the best, I don't think he is the best, but he's still a good player. I mean, again, like, as much as I do criticize him, I mean, again, I'm not saying that he is a bad player, Big Brother. He's obviously won a season, even though that season was very wonky. And again, controls an all-star season of the show, which is very impressive. To where, again, I do think he is a very good player, the one that I think probably has more holes than a lot of people like to say. But again, in comparison to everyone else in the letter W, again, there's not much competition here, to where he's a very easy pick. Next up, the letter X. There's literally only one option, and that person is a winner. So, I mean, I guess it's a competent person to pick, and that person is Xavier. I mean, he won. Yeah, I definitely have qualms with that win, but he did win. And to be fair, I think he is a very good physical competitor. He has good social aspects at points. He is good strategically at points. Does it really come together many times? Not really. And I think Reindeer Games kind of showed us that even more. But again, could be a worse player to be the sole person here. And could be a first boot like Kofi. So at least it's not that. So again, Xavier is the pick for the letter X. Next to the letter Y. And I'm actually shocked the fact that there isn't a person for the letter Y. And to where, again, when looking at the Survivor list, there was literally no one for U. Yeah, the letter Y did have a few people from the Survivor list. Yeah, again, on Big Brother, we don't have anybody. So again, no one I could pick here, but again, I'm kind of surprised that is the case. But finally, moving on to the final letter, where we have Z. Not many good options in Z. So again, we have Zakia, who is okay. Not a bad player, but also not a particularly good player either. We got Zach Rance, who was a mess. And also, again, like, okay-ish player. Person I end up going with here is also just not that good of a player, but again, at least came very close to winning the game. That person is Zach from BB8. Again, he was one comp away from winning the game in a near unanimous vote. That's something. Is it much? Not really, as really, I think the rest of his game is just kind of whatever. Again, he's kind of on the outs for a lot of the game. He isn't really taken seriously for a lot of the game. And while, again, he does gain the loyalty of the Donatos, and again, was very close to beating them, he doesn't. So, I mean, it's not great, but it's also, again, better than Zach Rance and Zakia. So, I mean, He's my pick for the letter Z. But there we go. I mean, that is my best player for every letter of the alphabet for Big Brother US. Now, moving forward, like I said with Survivor, I would like to do a best character version of this video down the road. So maybe stay tuned for that at some point. Also, in general, again, I'll probably just do more versions of this style of format for other concepts down the road. I think it's a fun thing to really expand on for potentially other shows. Also, just other things I can factor in here to talk about. So again, I'm sure I'll do more videos like this down the road. And obviously, just in general, expect more Survivor, Big Brother videos, other style of videos, just the typical content you would expect from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.